all had the experience. I'd like to begin with some of the comments made by Steven Pinker. We've all had the experience, writes Steven Pinker in The Better Angels of Our Nature, of reading about bloody war or shocking crime and asking, what is the world coming to? And that's the main thesis of his some 900-odd page volume. But we seldom ask, he continues, how bad was the world in the past? Pinker, of course, wants to show that the world of the past was much, much worse than we may be living in the most, and that we may be living in the most peaceable era of our species' existence. And he actually conducts a very elaborate study of how bloody and how violent world has been. So evidence of bloody history is not difficult to find. We might want to take a look at the genocides of the 20th century or genocides in the Old Testament and crucifixions in the New Testament, Pinker continues, or the gory mutilations in Shakespeare and Grimm brothers, or the British monarchs who very routinely beheaded their relatives, or the American founders who dueled with their rivals in the colonies. And one look at Rwanda, Bosnia, Syria, or Egypt, or Europe of the 20th and the 21st century, brings a very uniquely human and therefore a very uniquely violent history of the species to its full, lamentable actualization. Even Blaise Pascal has this very evocative quote where he says, what a chimera man is, what a novelty, what a monster, what a chaos. So Pinker's book, I believe, in the context of the world's bloody history, merits our attention, and because it presents in numbers evidence of the decline, as he says, of this brutal practice. He notes that tribal warfare was 9 times as deadly as war and genocide in the 20th century. He says that the murder rate in medieval Europe was more than 30 times what it is today. Slavery, sadistic punishments, and frivolous executions were unexceptionable features of life for millennia, then suddenly disappeared, or were abolished. Wars between developed countries have vanished. Rape, battering, hate crimes, deadly riots, child abuse, cruelty to animals are all substantially down. So he continues by asking, how could have this happened when human nature has not changed much? What led people to stop sacrificing children, Pinker asks, stabbing each other at the dinner table, or burning cats, or disemboweling each other, or disemboweling criminals as a form of cruel and unusual punishment, or popular entertainment. So the key to explaining violence, or the decline of violence for Pinker, is to understand what he calls the inner demons that incline us towards violence, such as revenge and sadism or tribalism, and the better angels that steer us away. So thanks to the spread of government, or the art of diplomacy, particularly the art of diplomacy, literacy, trade, and cosmopolitanism, and I'd like to underscore cosmopolitanism here, we have come to increasingly control our impulses, empathize with others, bargain rather than plunder, he says, debunk toxic ideologies, and deploy our powers of reason to reduce the temptations of conflict and violence. So by underscoring cosmopolitanism, I'd like to expand on this norm, the cosmopolitan norm upon which I will argue the contemporary international human rights regime is based, and the modern supranational judicial regime rests. So cosmopolitan norms hold that every human being possesses an intrinsic worth, and we recognize this as being embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for instance. We are, as human beings, entitled to human rights merely by being human. And this moral worth and entitlement must be recognized and respected by others. It's not a frivolous norm. And the state, which is a novel concept, must exist for the sake of the individual, for the individual human being and not vice versa. So if these cosmopolitan sentiments, as I said, sound familiar, is that it is because they constitute an important foundation for international law. So when in the 1948, only 3 years after the conclusion of the most pernicious conflict in the history of the 20th century, the framers of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights transcribed these worlds that all human beings are equal in dignity, they're born free and equal in dignity and possess rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood. They could not have known that the wounded but still very recalcitrant international state system and the entrenched but capricious, interest-driven political environment would effectively mute their full symbolic weight until the dawn of the new millennium. So gradually the importance and the condition of sovereignty and territorial integrity as the casus belli, if you will, of international relations were undermined and diminished by the processes of economic and political globalization. The normative foundations of the legal order have begun to shift from state sovereignty-oriented approaches. If you have read Ruti Title's book, Humanities Law, she certainly points to that trend, the emerging trend. So there's less emphasis on state sovereignty as the foundation of legal and political order, and the emergence of the human rights or the human-oriented, human beings-oriented approaches to politics and law. So it transforms this very conflict-prone political milieu, socio-political milieu, into a much more peaceful orbis pacificum, if you will, which holds perpetrators of crimes against humanity, crimes offensive to human conscience and dignity, to the highest possible legal and moral standard. And contemporary scholars of international politics and international law have not neglected to point that out. In fact, they point out that this humanitarian cosmopolitan turn is very much seen in the International Criminal Court, in the European Court of Human Rights, in the European Court of Justice, because these institutions further the humanity-based scheme of jurisdiction that follows the person, as Ruti Title says. So no longer are citizens thought of as a standing reserve. If you've read Heidegger, that term might seem very familiar, for free and unchecked use by and abuse by states and the heads of states. The law and the supranational legal regime increasingly protects these individuals from frivolous and unmitigated violence and abuse. So the European Convention of Human Rights and the corresponding European Court of Human Rights are but just a few instances and good instances of this new normative cosmopolitan orientation. But of course, it would be too idealistic and too premature to conclude that supranational judicial regimes can replace states in the protection of human interests and more resolute recognition of human rights. It's imperative, however, to recognize that cosmopolitan approaches to law by the supranational judicial bodies must co-evolve alongside such norms as state sovereignty or superior prerogatives of state security. So I want to suggest perhaps a key challenge to us here, international human rights scholars, political scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, is to think about the key challenges that really do lie ahead of us, and that is international for us, international politics rests in the examinations of the many ways in which state sovereignty certainly must be retooled in the context of political and economic globalization. So these new institutions, these new concepts, international politics as an idea and as a practice must be retooled in relation to and must be rerouted, if you will, in the direction of the evolving modes of global institutional governance and human rights discourse. These supranational norms and courts, not states, I argue, will play a much more active and engaging role in the promotion of cosmopolitan norms regimes and human rights. And they will privilege the individual above the state interests. As a result, individuals themselves will play a much more active role in how politics is shaped. I know I have very limited amount of time, but I'd like to point to certain tensions. Of course, there will be tensions between personal responsibility and the privileges of sovereign immunity. Heads of state currently under this new emerging norm are held accountable for crimes of war and genocide and crimes against humanity. This is a novel emerging norm. And the ICC and the European Court of Human Rights can hold individuals accountable for the abuse and misuse of power. There are international conventions and treaties which are going to probably conflict with enlightened self-interests of sovereign nation states. And state sovereignty and immunity, of course, must also co-evolve and address the universal jurisdiction and human rights law and humanitarian law. Just very briefly, this is the sort of the impact that these supranational institutions, the ICC, the ECHR, can have on states. And they, of course, will expand not only the normative dimension of politics and law, legal discourse, but they will probably have a very direct impact on the heads of state, on citizens. They will augment state interests. When states and heads of states are held accountable for abuse and neglect, these courts can hold them accountable. And these courts will also increase jurisdiction over the acts of state that up to now have been given a free card, if you will, in politics and the conduct of war. So this is just to introduce perhaps a novel form of an institution that can very ably, although gradually, address the, in a progressive way, advance diplomatic discourse or the culture of diplomacy, if you will. Thank you very much.